The firing range at Camp Mackall had no witness at that hour. No cadre officers with clipboards. No other candidates watching from the observation platform. Nothing moving in the gray light of that pre-dawn morning, except the wind rolling off the sandhills and one woman standing at the firing line with a rifle across her chest, and 1,800 yards of North Carolina scrubland stretched out in front of her. The steel target at the far end of the range was roughly the size of a dinner plate. At that distance, it was invisible to the naked eye. She knew exactly where it was because she had measured the distance herself the night before, on her hands and knees in the dark, with a laser rangefinder she had borrowed from no one. She had been formally expelled from this facility approximately 72 hours after she arrived. She had been told her training methods were unauthorized. She had been told the manual she carried violated facility regulations. She had been told, with measured institutional calm, by a colonel with 30 years of service behind him, that she was to collect her equipment and vacate her billet by 0800. She had not collected a single thing. To understand why she was standing at that firing line alone on the fifth morning, without authorization and without anyone's approval, you had to go back to the beginning. You had to go back 4 days, to the moment she first walked through the main gate at Mackall, and you had to understand exactly what she was carrying when she did. Sergeant First Class Gail Wynne arrived at Camp Mackall on a Tuesday morning in October, under a sky so pale and flat it looked like paper. She was 34 years old, 11 years in the United States Army behind her, the last 7 attached to Special Forces units in roles that appeared on official records as intelligence support, and that everyone who worked alongside her understood to mean something considerably more complicated. She had made precision shots in 4 countries. She had done so without formal sniper qualification, because the units she served with moved too fast for paperwork, and the only thing that ever mattered in those moments was whether the round connected. Now she was here to make it official. The Special Forces Sniper Qualification Course at Camp Mackall, North Carolina, was the most demanding precision marksmanship program in the United States Army. Candidates arrived with years of field experience and left either with a certificate that changed the arc of their career, or with a particular kind of silence that comes from failing at something you were absolutely certain you could do. The attrition rate was not published anywhere. It did not need to be. Gail carried 1 deployment bag. Inside were her uniforms, her field maintenance kit, a personal notebook filled with 11 years of range observations and field calculations, and one other item she had not yet opened. A sealed canvas document sleeve roughly the size of a legal envelope that her mother had handed her 14 months ago at a kitchen table in Fayetteville, after the second of 3 glasses of sweet tea, without ceremony or explanation. Her mother had only said that Roe had wanted her to have it, and that she would know when the time came. She had placed it at the bottom of the bag and had not moved it since. She signed in at the reception desk and received her billet assignment, her equipment manifest, and a 1-page briefing document. She read it in under 5 minutes while standing at the counter. She folded it precisely and put it in her breast pocket. The specialist handling intake watched her do this and said nothing. Her issued rifle was an M2010 enhanced sniper rifle chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. She inspected it at the armory counter with a thoroughness that made the armorer look up from his screen twice. She checked the barrel crown with her fingertip. She checked the bolt face under the overhead light. She pressed against the scope mount rail with her thumb until the angle of pressure told her whether the mounting torque was correct. She noted what she found. She said nothing about it. She carried the rifle to her billet, field stripped it completely, and spent 40 minutes cleaning components that were already clean, because that was how she had always thought about rifles, not as tools that could be clean enough, as tools that should know her hands completely before they were asked to do anything important. She reassembled it in the dark, not because the overhead light was off, because it was on and she closed her eyes anyway. Master Sergeant Bale Prynne conducted the candidate welcome brief at 0700. He was 52 years old and had the kind of physical authority that comes not from size but from absolute certainty about his own standing in a room. He stood at the front of the briefing space in a uniform pressed to the edge of aggression and spoke without notes for 31 minutes. He covered core structure, qualification standards, the history of the facility, and the program's lineage going back to the 1970s. He mentioned the standing facility record for long-range precision fire. He mentioned it once briefly, and did not say whose record it was. He did not need to. Gale sat in the third row and listened without writing a single word. There were 19 candidates in the room, 14 men and 5 women. Gale was the only one present under an instructor candidacy track rather than standard qualification, which meant she had cleared additional screening to be here, which meant she was also being evaluated against a higher standard than every other person in that room. She had not been told this explicitly. She had read it in the fine print of her orders. Prynne had a manner that was, on the surface, entirely correct. He was not hostile. He was not dismissive. He addressed the assembled candidates with a formality that could easily be read as respect. But Gale had spent 11 years reading the posture of men in positions of authority, and what she read in Prynne went beyond professionalism. It was the careful and practiced presentation of a man who had arranged his entire identity around being the most capable person in any given room, and who had organized this facility in a way that made any serious challenge to that position structurally difficult. After the brief, he moved through the room for individual introductions. When he reached Gale, he paused for a beat longer than he had paused for anyone else. He read her name tape. He read the service designation on her record card. He said, "First time at Mackall, Sergeant." She said, "Yes, Sergeant." He nodded once, not the nod of a man who was satisfied, the nod of a man who was filing something away. The first range evolution began at 0900. It was a cold-bore precision shoot at 600 yards, prone supported, 5 rounds, under a light crosswind from the southwest at approximately 8 miles per hour. The exercise was a baseline assessment. It was not designed to challenge experienced shooters. It was designed to establish a starting point for each candidate and give the cadre an initial read on what they were working with. Prynne briefed the standard wind reading method. He described the use of the Kestrel weather meter at the firing position, the calculation of a wind value from the meter reading, the scope adjustment procedure, and the method for holding off center when residual variance remained. He demonstrated this with the practiced ease of a man who had given the same demonstration many hundreds of times. Every other candidate took notes. Several asked clarifying questions. Gale watched the grass at mid-range while all of this was happening. She was watching not the direction it leaned, but the specific angle at which individual blades bent and then recovered after each gust. She was watching the faint shimmer beginning to build above the clay surface at the 400-yard line as the morning sun climbed. She was noting the difference between what the Kestrel at the firing position was reading and what the grass at 300 yards was actually doing. They were not the same. When her relay was called, she set up at her assigned lane, established her prone position, adjusted her support, and took 2 slow breaths. She did not consult the Kestrel. She watched the grass at mid-range one final time. Then she looked through her scope and she fired. 5 rounds, 1 minute and 38 seconds. When candidates moved forward to score after the ceasefire call, the range officer measured Gale's group twice. 4 rounds had passed through a single ragged hole. The 5th had opened the group by less than a quarter inch. At 600 yards from a cold bore in a crosswind, this was the kind of result that makes every person in the vicinity go quiet for a moment. Prin looked at the target. He looked at Gale. He looked at the Kestrel reading at her lane, which showed a wind value that, if applied through the standard method he had just briefed, would have placed her rounds slightly left of center. Her rounds were dead center. He said nothing. He moved to the next lane. That evening, after the range had closed and most candidates were in the dining facility or their billets, Gale was in the far corner of the day room with her field notebook open when Prin came in. He did not come in the way a supervisor enters a common space. He came in slowly, with deliberate and unhurried movement. He poured coffee from the urn near the window, stood with it for a moment as though the cup required his consideration, and then crossed the room and sat down across from her. He said, "Your father was Ro Win." It was not a question. She kept her eyes on her notebook for one full beat, then she looked up. He said, "I knew him, not as a colleague, as his student. He was an instructor at this facility in the late 90s. I came through this program as a candidate in 1999. Sergeant Wynn ran the long-range evaluation block that year. Best instructor I ever had." He said this with what appeared to be genuine feeling. His voice carried real weight on the word best, not performed, something that sounded like actual memory. Gale said, "He never mentioned Mackall to me." Prin held his coffee with both hands. He said, "That was your father. He left the range at the range. He told us that once in a way that made clear it was not advice but a description of how he lived. He kept what mattered to him at home separate from what mattered to the army, and he never confused the two." He paused. "I heard about Korengal. I was sorry. He deserved better than that valley." She said, "Thank you." He studied her for a moment in the flat overhead light. Then he said, "You shoot like him. The wind read today, the hold. That was not the method I briefed this morning. You know another method." She said, "I shoot the way I was taught." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he stood. He took his coffee. At the door he stopped and said, without turning, "That technique performs well at sea level. We will see how it holds as we increase complexity and distance." He left. Gale sat without moving for a full minute after he was gone. Then she opened her field notebook to a clean page and wrote 2 words at the top in small, careful letters. "Ask WHY." She did not write anything else. She looked at those 2 words until the light through the window changed color as the last of the evening drained out of the sky. If Prin had been her father's student, if he had learned directly from Ro Win, then why was the doctrine he was teaching in that briefing room the direct opposite of the doctrine her father had spent the last decade of his life developing? Not a variation, not an evolution, the opposite. Her father's methodology was built around a single foundational principle that challenged the way precision shooters had been taught to read wind for decades. The standard approach used a weather meter at the shooter's position. The meter told you what the wind was doing at the location where you were standing. In flat terrain at low elevation, this was adequate. In mountain terrain above 7,000 feet, it was not adequate. It was systematically wrong. In mountain terrain, the wind at the bullet's flight path was frequently doing something entirely different from the wind at the shooter's position. Thermal gradients, terrain channeling, ridgeline compression effects. The meter gave you data that felt precise and scientific, and that described the wrong location. You were measuring wind where you stood. The bullet did not fly where you stood. The bullet flew through 800 yards, 1,200 yards, 1,800 yards of air that was doing its own thing, shaped by the terrain it passed over. and the meter at your elbow could not see any of that. Her father had found the correction. You read the mirage, the visual distortion that heat creates above any ground surface, visible through a rifle scope at appropriate magnification. The mirage showed what the wind was doing along the bullet's path, not at the shooter's position, not at the start, along the entire trajectory. The mirage told the truth that the meter could not reach. He had compiled this methodology into a formal document. He had tried for years to get it incorporated into Army sniper curriculum. He had taught it informally to every shooter he worked alongside. Prin was teaching the meter method, presenting it as complete, as authoritative, as if no serious alternative had ever existed. The question Gale had written at the top of that page was not rhetorical. The next morning's evolution was a stalking exercise. Candidates were required to move from the tree line at the western edge of the training area to within a prescribed distance of an observer position without being detected, take a shot at a designated target, and then withdraw. The observer used binoculars and a spotting scope and had authority to declare any candidate compromised the moment they made a detectable error in movement, sound, or visible signature. For most candidates, this was the most psychologically demanding element of the program. It required absolute patience. It required the ability to become, in the most literal sense, invisible, to move without appearing to move, to occupy ground without announcing it. Gale had spent years doing this in environments where the consequence for being spotted was not a failing grade. She moved out at first light. She used terrain. She used shadow. She used the specific moment when a bird took flight from a tree at the north edge of the training area to cross an exposed patch of ground during the 3 seconds when the observer's attention would follow the movement before returning to the field of scan. She reached the prescribed distance in 2 hours and 40 minutes. She fired her shot. She withdrew. The observer did not acquire her at any point during the evolution. After she marked in, the observer looked at her, then at his notes, then at the cadre sergeant beside him. Something passed between those two men. It was not a word. It was during the debrief that she first watched Sergeant Cato Hearn with real attention. Hearn was 25 years old with the kind of physical build that suggested he had been serious about the work of soldiering since long before he was old enough to enlist. His service record showed 2 deployments, a commendation for exceptional performance during a direct fire engagement in eastern Afghanistan, and 1 previous attempt at this same course, 11 months ago, that had ended in administrative failure during the long-range qualification phase. He was not a man who quit. The record was clear on that. He was a man who had failed. Those are different things. Gale had learned the difference from her father before she was old enough to understand why the distinction mattered. During the debrief, Prin's senior cadre sergeant, a compact man named Wickfield who spoke in a permanently lowered register, as if sound itself was a finite resource, went through the assessments candidate by candidate. When he reached Hearn, he let a pause sit in the room before reading the score aloud. Hearn had been acquired by the observer at the 43-minute mark. He had not reached the prescribed distance. The shot he had taken from a suboptimal position had missed the target by 14 inches. Wickfield said, "Hearn, when the observer marked you, you were moving upslope through an open corridor 20 meters wide with no cover on either side. What was your read on that ground?" Hearn said, "I was following the standard approach vector from the pre-exercise brief, Sergeant." Wickfield said, "The vector is a framework, not a route. You have to read the terrain in front of you." Hearn said, "Understood, Sergeant." He said it with the controlled, steady voice of a man who was not certain he understood, and who was afraid to say so, because saying so would cost him something he could not afford to lose a second time. After the debrief ended and candidates moved toward the adjacent classroom for the afternoon instruction block, Gale paused in the doorway and looked back. Hearn was still at the table, alone, with the debrief score sheet in front of him. He was looking at it the way a person looks at a document written in a language they have studied but never fully mastered. She said, "Hearn." He looked up. She said, "The approach corridor from the brief has a drainage channel running along the western edge of that slope. From above on a map, it looks like a gap in the ground cover. From surface level, it is 3 feet of dead space with 8-inch grass along both sides. You could have moved through it without breaking the ridge line at any point during your approach." He stared at her. She said, "That is not in the doctrine brief. That is terrain reading. Those are not the same skill." She went through the door. At the long-range range that afternoon, the wind had shifted. It was coming now from the northwest at a variable speed that the kestrel meter at the firing position was reading as somewhere between 11 and 14 miles per hour. This was the kind of variable condition that made the standard method unreliable, not technically wrong at close range. Unreliable at long range in the way that a small directional error, compounded across 900 yards of bullet flight, turns a center hit into a clean miss with no apparent explanation. The evolution was a qualification shoot at 900 yards. Gale watched the range surface during the safety brief. She watched the grass at 600 yards and the way it moved. She watched the tree line at the far end of the impact zone where the branches of the pine trees told a slightly different story than the meter at her feet. She watched the mirage building above the clay and sand of the range surface in the afternoon heat. Thin, but readable. Enough. Through her scope at low magnification, she could see it clearly. The shimmer moved at an angle that was not quite northwest, not quite what the meter said. The difference was perhaps 15 degrees of arc. At 900 yards, 15 degrees of wind angle is the difference between a center hit and a miss, and between a miss that looks like shooter error and a miss that is actually instrument error, and between an instructor who tells you to trust the meter and a man who has built 20 years of career on that instruction being correct. She adjusted her scope for what the shimmer was telling her, and not for what the instrument at her feet reported. She fired 7 rounds in the prescribed window. 7 center hits. Prin was at the scoring position when the results came through. Gale did not look at him, but she was aware of exactly where he was standing, and she understood the quality of his silence and what it meant. That evening, she went to the technical library. The room sat adjacent to the main classroom building, small and quiet and smelling like paper and metal shelving, and the particular closed-air quality of documents that have not been moved in a long time, open to candidates during evening hours for reference and study. She had asked the duty NCO that morning, casually and in passing, whether the facility maintained historical training documents. The duty NCO had confirmed it, most of it still on paper, organized by decade, going back to the early 1980s. She began at the historical reference section at the back of the room and worked forward methodically, pulling documents by their spines, reading the covers, replacing them. She was looking for something specific, and she did not know exactly what form it would take when she found it. She found it behind a set of training circulars from 2009, pushed to the back of the second shelf from the bottom, invisible unless you pulled the circulars forward toward you. It was a soft-cover document roughly 2 inches thick, plain green cover with black text. The title read, "Advanced Terrain-Based Wind Estimation for Mountain Operations, a Field Methodology for Precision Fire Above 7,000 Feet Elevation." Below the title in smaller text, prepared by Master Sergeant R.T. Wynn, SFQCS Instructor, Camp Mackall, North Carolina. Below that, centered, in a red stamp that had bled slightly into the fibers of the paper. Superseded BY Order of Commandant, February 2008. Gale stood in the empty library and held that document with both hands. February 2008. 7 months after her father died in Korengal Valley. She opened it. The pages were clean and dry. The manual had not been read in years, possibly not since the stamp was applied. The prose was her father's, exactly as she recognized his voice. Direct, technical, precise, with the occasional quality of a man who understood something important and was holding his own certainty to a standard of evidence before he would let it move forward. Patient urgency. That was the phrase that came to her. He had always moved like a man who knew the destination and understood that running would not get him there faster. She read for 20 minutes standing at the shelf. The core principle was exactly what she had been taught since childhood, rendered now in formal technical language for an Army training document. The wind meter measures wind at your position. The Mirage shows wind along the bullet's path. In mountain terrain above 7,000 feet, these two data sources diverge significantly and systematically due to thermal gradient effects and terrain channel dynamics that ground-level instruments cannot capture. The standard method produces a predictable directional error in this environment. The error is not random. It is calculable. You read the Mirage, not the meter. This is not intuition. This is physics. And physics does not change its behavior based on what is currently printed in a training manual. At the back of the document, before the appendices, was a section titled Review and Validation. 14 names were listed. Beside each name was a handwritten note in the margin indicating that reviewer's individual response to the methodology. She ran her finger down the list. 12 of the 14 responses contained phrases like these: methodology validated by field application, results consistent with observed data across 3 test environments, recommend formal incorporation into training curriculum at earliest opportunity. 2 responses contained no marginal note at all. The 13th name had a blank margin, just the name, no comment, no annotation. The 14th name also had no marginal note, but the name itself had been circled in pencil, so faintly that she would not have seen it unless she held the page at a low angle to the overhead light. Sergeant Bale Prynne. Below his name in her father's handwriting was a single line. Response pending. Exam results on file, Section 3, variable error. She read that line 4 times. Then she closed the manual. She stood in the quiet of the library with the document pressed against her chest, and the overhead light making a faint hum above her, and the weight of what she had just read settling into her slowly, the way cold settles, from the outside in. Pending, her father had flagged Prynne specifically, not as an opponent, not as a confirmed ally, as an open case, with a reference to exam results, a specific section, a variable error from 1999, from 26 years ago. She did not know what Section 3 contained. She replaced the manual behind the training circulars exactly as she had found it. She adjusted the surrounding documents so that nothing appeared disturbed. She turned off the library light at the switch and walked down the corridor toward the billets. In the administrative building across the courtyard, a window was lit. On the second floor, Master Sergeant Bale Prynne sat at his desk with his laptop open, cycling through the facility security camera feeds the way he did every evening as part of his administrative routine. He moved through them in sequence: the main classroom, the equipment cage, the vehicle lot, perimeter cameras 1 through 6, the dining facility exterior. When he reached the library feed, he stopped. On the monitor, the timestamp in the lower corner read 1947. A figure stood at the back shelves of the library. He watched her pull documents, read the spines, replace them, watched her reach behind the training circulars on the second shelf from the bottom, watched her remove a document. She stood with that document for 20 minutes. He leaned forward in his chair. Then he sat back. He put both hands flat on the desk surface and looked at the ceiling the way a man looks at a ceiling when a calculation he has been running quietly in his head for many years has just changed in a way he cannot reverse. He reached for his phone. He dialed a number he had not called in many years. The area code was South Carolina. The call connected after 3 rings. He said, "She found the manual tonight." A pause on the other end. He said, "I am certain." Another pause. The voice on the line spoke briefly, in the flat tone of someone receiving information they had long considered a possibility. He said, "It changes what we have to do. We move the timeline forward." He ended the call. He set the phone down on the desk. He sat for a long time without moving, watching the security feed as the library light went dark and the frame showed nothing but an empty room. He kept watching anyway. That night in her billet, Gail sat on the edge of her bunk with her field notebook open on her knees. The barracks were quiet around her. The only sound was the wind off the sandhills moving through the longleaf pines at the edge of the training area, shifting slightly every few minutes, the way a variable wind does when the pressure gradient above it is still settling. She wrote TRD validated. 12 of 14 reviewers, formal documentation on file. Prin listed as reviewer 14. Response marked pending. Reference to Section 3, variable error 1999. Correlation. Curriculum currently taught at this facility directly contradicts TRD methodology at every critical technical point. Not updated, not revised, reversed. Why was the methodology suppressed rather than incorporated? Who signed the Commandant Order in February 2008? What happened in Section 3? She looked at what she had written. She was a precise person and she did not like conclusions that arrived ahead of their evidence. Her father had told her this, not as advice but as a description of how serious work gets done. He had said, "I do not confuse suspicion with fact, but I do not ignore patterns. A pattern is a fact. It is just a fact about shape rather than content." The pattern here was clear enough to stand on. Her father had developed a methodology that 12 independent experts had formally validated. That methodology had been suppressed 7 months after his death, by order of a commandant whose name she had not yet found. The man now in charge of doctrine at this facility had been one of her father's evaluation candidates in 1999. His evaluation response had been flagged as pending, with a specific reference to a variable error in an exam she had not yet seen. The man had spent 20 years teaching the wrong method. Not just wrong in the way that any doctrine becomes outdated over time. Wrong in the specific and directional way that her father had identified and documented and attempted to correct. She turned off the light. She lay back with her hands behind her head and listened to the wind moving through the pines. Her father had taught her to listen to wind before she was old enough to read. He had taken her to a field outside Fayetteville on a cold Saturday morning when she was 9 years old and stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders and said, "Listen to what it is doing now, not what the thermometer says, not what the forecast said this morning. Now. The instrument tells you what the wind has already done. Your ears and your eyes can tell you what it is doing now. Always prefer now." She listened. The wind changed direction at approximately 01:30. She felt it before the trees told her. She noted it without moving. She lay in the dark and let the information settle. 4 days from now, she would be standing at the firing line with no orders, no authorization, and no one watching except the wind, and 1,800 yards of open ground between her and a steel plate the size of a dinner plate, and her father's voice in the back of her mind saying what it had always said. Read the ground, not the instrument, the ground. She did not know that yet. She only knew what she knew right now. And right now, in a lit office across the courtyard, a man who had been her father's student in 1999 was sitting in the dark looking at an empty security feed, a phone on his desk, a South Carolina area code still glowing in the recent calls list. He was rearranging the pieces of something he had kept buried for 17 years, and the thing that had been buried was surfacing, one evening at a time, in a way he could not stop without doing something he had not had to do before. In the morning there would be another evolution. She would be ready. And so, in a very different way, would he. The grass at the eastern edge of the Mackall training area was tall enough, in the low pre-dawn light of the third morning, to hide a person who knew how to become part of it. Most people who tried to hide in grass moved wrong. They moved like people who were trying not to move, which is entirely different from actually not moving. They stopped their feet, but their hands still adjusted. They held their breath, but their shoulders still rose with the effort of holding it. They went still in the way that a stopped clock is still, which is to say frozen, and frozen things have a signature that a trained observer can read at distance because nothing in nature holds itself that rigidly. Trees move. Grass moves. Animals shift weight and resettle. The only thing that locks itself absolutely motionless in an open field is a person who is afraid of being seen. Gale Wynne did not move like that. She moved the way water moves in a level container. She did not go still. She flowed into stillness. She used the wind that bent the grass to move herself, so that when the stalks tilted, she tilted with them, and when they recovered, she had already arrived at the next position. She used the terrain the way her father had taught her to use it, not as a surface to cross, but as a material to become. The ground was not an obstacle. It was a medium. You moved through it the way sound moves through air, without friction, without announcement, by becoming the thing that was already there. At 3:47, she was lying in a depression 6 inches deep at 160 yards from the observer tower. She had moved 800 yards in 3 hours and 40 minutes through open training terrain in October darkness. The observer had not acquired her at any point. She was lying at the natural angle of the ground with grass arranged at the angle the wind had established, not at any angle suggesting a human hand. She took her shot, settled her breathing, one smooth press of the trigger. The suppressed report of the M2010 was brief and flat, and the open air swallowed it before it fully registered. The round struck the target board. The spotter behind the observer tower raised his hand. Gale was already moving back. She cleared the training area at 5:21 and marked in at the exfiltration point. Cadre Sergeant Wickfield was there with his score sheet, and he looked at her for a moment and then looked at the time on his sheet and wrote something down without speaking. When the debrief convened at 700, Prin ran through the candidate results with his usual economy. When he reached Gale's assessment, he paused. Not the long pause he used when a result was poor. A shorter one. The pause of a man reading a number twice because the first time did not produce the response he had prepared. He said, "Win 160 yards. No acquisition. Exfil within window." He moved to the next candidate. He said nothing more, and he did not need to. Every person in that room understood what 160 yards of undetected approach represented. The facility record for the stalking evolution was 147 yards. That record had stood for 11 years. Gale was 3 days into the course. After the debrief, candidates moved to the range for the morning qualification evolution. The day's exercise was a precision shoot at 1,000 yards under variable wind. Prin assigned firing lanes from a clipboard with numbers already written in before the brief began. When he called Gail's name, he assigned her to Lane 12. Lane 12 sat at the far northern end of the range, in the direct path of wind coming off the northwest tree line. The crosswind at that position was stronger and more variable than at any other lane. The afternoon sun, behind and to the right of most candidates, would be directly ahead of her at a low angle during the final third of the qualification window. There was no rotation schedule requiring that assignment. There was only the name on the clipboard and the number already written beside it. Gail took her equipment to Lane 12 without comment. She built her firing position. She adjusted her support bag, mounted her scope, and looked downrange. The mirage was already building above the range surface in the morning heat, thin and wavering, and she read what it was telling her. Lane 12 was harder. The wind was stronger and the light was worse, and the mirage was less stable because of the turbulence from the tree line at her back. But the mirage still told the truth. It always told the truth. You had to listen more carefully when the signal was weaker, which was not a different skill. It was the same skill under more pressure. She read what the shimmer was showing her across the full length of the lane. She made her adjustments based on what the range itself was showing her, not on what the instrument at her feet reported. The two were not the same thing and had never been. She fired 9 rounds in the prescribed window. 8 center hits. 1 round opened the group by just under half an inch at 1,000 yards. Wickfield scored her target. He recorded the result without expression. When Prin reviewed the score sheets that afternoon in the administrative office, he sat with Gail's sheet for a long time. Then he added a notation in the technique column. The notation read, "Non-standard wind reading method, inconsistent with brief technique, -2 points methodology deviation. 8 center hits at 1,000 yards in the worst conditions on the range, 2 points deducted, not for missing, for how she did not miss." It was after the afternoon evolution that Hearn found her. He came to the equipment rack outside the armory when the other candidates had moved toward the dining facility, and the cadre had gone inside. He came the way a man comes when he wants to speak to someone without appearing to do so, walking with a purpose that could, from a distance, be read as simply moving from one point to another. He stopped beside her at the rack. He did not look at her directly. He said very quietly, "I need to show you something." She continued working on her cleaning kit. She said, "Show me." He took a folded sheet of paper from the inside pocket of his jacket and held it at waist level, angled so that she could read it without either of them appearing to look at it. She looked. It was a page of handwritten notes, 2 columns. On the left, figures she recognized as kestrel weather readings recorded at the range, the kind of readings candidates noted from the mounted instruments at the firing position before each evolution. On the right, corresponding figures in a different hand, figures from the official data cards that cadre issued to candidates at the range brief. The 2 sets of numbers did not match. Not by the small amounts that happen when instruments sit at different heights or different positions on the range, by amounts large enough to shift the calculated wind value in a direction that would move a 1,000-yard round off-center, consistently, always in the same direction, for one candidate. She looked at the name written at the top of the page. It was Hearn's name. She said, "How long have you been keeping this?" He said, "Since the second range session. I thought it was a data entry mistake at first. I kept recording because I kept missing and my numbers were not matching my holds. I checked the mounted instruments myself after 3 sessions, and the readings were not the same as what was on my brief card. She folded the paper and handed it back to him. She said, "Do not show this to anyone else. Do not mention it to the cadre. Do not leave it anywhere it can be found." He stared at her. He said, "What does it mean?" She said, "It means you are not missing because you are failing. You are missing because someone is giving you the wrong numbers to fail with." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is not a clerical error." She said, "No." She shouldered her cleaning kit and walked toward the barracks building. She did not look back. She was aware of him standing at the equipment rack behind her with the folded paper and the particular stillness of a man whose understanding of his own situation has just been reorganized without his consent. This was the third turn. And the third turn in a sequence tells you the first two were not accidents. She had understood that Prin was suppressing her scores with deductions that had no technical basis. She had understood that her father's methodology had been buried by an administrative order issued 7 months after his death. Now she understood that the manipulation was not limited to her. It was ongoing. Applied to any candidate whose genuine performance challenged the standard that Prin had spent 20 years defining and defending, which was the standard built on the doctrine her father had spent the last decade of his life identifying as wrong. She went to her billet and sat at her desk and opened her notebook to the page where she had written Ask WHY. The question still stood, but it was sharper now. Not just why had the doctrine been suppressed? Why was it still being enforced? What was at stake in keeping it enforced? For a man in a position to falsify weather data cards for individual candidates. The answer that was forming was larger than she had expected when she walked through the gate 4 days ago. She was still writing when the knock came. It was not a candidate's knock. It was the specific measured knock of a person who knows they have the authority to enter whether they knock or not, and who is knocking as formality rather than request. She said, "Enter." Prin came in. Wickfield was 1 step behind him, in the position of a man present as witness rather than participant. Prin looked around the billet with the measured attention of someone who has already decided what he is looking for and is confirming its location. His eyes went to the desk, then to her field bag against the wall, then to the shelf beside the bunk. He said, "We are here to collect a document." She said, "What document?" He said, "The training manual you removed from the technical library 2 evenings ago. It is government property. It should not have left that room." She said, "You know exactly which manual you mean." He said, "I do." She opened the bottom of her field bag and took out the canvas document sleeve. She held it for a moment with both hands. Then she set it on the desk between them. Prin picked it up. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has thought about for a very long time. Then he turned to Wickfield and handed it over without opening it. He said, "Thank you, Sergeant." He turned to leave. At the door he stopped with his back to her. He said, "The manual is outdated material. It was superseded for sound reasons by people with better information than was available when it was written. This facility moved forward. That is what institutional progress looks like." She said, "Progress in which direction?" He turned and looked at her. His face did not change, but something behind it moved briefly, like a reflection disturbed on still water. He left. Wickfield followed. She sat alone with the empty space on the desk where the document had been. She looked at it. She did not move to pack anything. She did not reach for her notebook. She sat with the stillness of a person taking precise inventory of what they have left. The following morning at 800, she was called to the administrative office. Colonel Devlin Dane, occupied the position behind his desk with the ease of a man who had sat behind desks like this one for 20 years, and who understood that a desk, in the right context, is a weapon as significant as anything you carry to a range. He was 57 years old. He had a combat record from 3 decades in special forces that other men referenced in lowered voices, and a physical bearing that suggested the record was accurate. He wore his authority the way old soldiers wear old coats, without display, without explanation, as simple, durable fact. Prince stood to the left of the desk. Wickfield was near the door. Dane looked at the file in front of him, and then at Gale. He said, "You provided unsanctioned instruction to a candidate under evaluation. That is a violation of course protocol under paragraph 7 of the Conduct Standard. You also removed government property from a facility area without authorization." She said, "The document was in an area open to all candidates during evening hours. It was not in a secured location." Dane said, "The document had been administratively retired from the active collection. Its removal was a violation regardless of the room's general access status." She said, "The instruction I provided to Sergeant Hearn consisted of a verbal observation about a terrain feature he had already passed through. It was not a formal instruction session, and no scoring evaluation was active at that moment." Dane said, "Master Sergeant Prynne has determined it constituted unsanctioned coaching during an active evaluation period." She said, "Master Sergeant Prynne was not present during the exchange." Dane said, "I am aware of that. I have reviewed the determination and I am upholding it." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the training area was visible in the morning light, the long grass moving in the northwest wind, the distant tree lying dark against the sky. Dane said, "You have 48 hours to coordinate your departure from this facility. Your instructor candidacy status is suspended pending formal review. Written notification will reach you within the hour." She stood, she said, "Sir." He looked at her. She said, "The doctrine being taught at this facility produces a calculable directional error in mountain terrain above 7,000 feet. That error is not random. It is systematic and predictable, and it has consequences in environments where precision is the difference between a successful mission and something worse. The methodology that corrects it was formally validated by 12 independent reviewers at this facility. It was suppressed by administrative order 7 months after the man who developed it died in a valley where that same error may have played a role in how things went. I am not requesting a reversal of your decision. I am asking you to consider whether the right thing and the current thing are the same thing." Dane held her gaze for a long moment. The expression on his face gave nothing. Behind it, something was present that she could not read and did not have time to pursue. He said, "You have your 48 hours, Sergeant." She nodded once. She walked out of the room. In her billet, with the door closed, she sat on the edge of her bunk and did not move for 4 minutes. She had learned from her father that the first 4 minutes after a significant blow were the most dangerous, because the mind in those 4 minutes wants to move before it has finished thinking, and movement before thinking is the fastest way to make a difficult situation permanent. After 4 minutes she stood. She went to her field bag and removed her notebook. She sat back down. She looked at the space on the desk where the manual had been. She reached toward it from habit. Her hand found nothing but air. She held that empty space for a moment and felt the particular weight of an absence. Then she was not in the billet anymore. She was 9 years old, standing in a field outside Fayetteville on a cold October Saturday, and the grass was knee-high, and the morning air carried the particular edge that came in off the sandhills before the sun established itself. Her father stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders, light and steady, the way he held things when he wanted you to feel the presence of them without feeling the pressure of them. He said, "Hold still and tell me what the grass is doing." She said, "It is bending toward the right." He said, "Good. Now look through the scope and tell me what the air above the ground is doing." She pressed her eye to the scope. At low power, the shimmer above the field surface was visible. It moved slowly, tilting at an angle that was not quite the same as the grass below it. She said, "The shimmer is going a different way than the grass." He said, "That is correct. That is always correct. The kestrel at your shoulder will tell you what the wind has already done at the place where you are standing. The shimmer will tell you what the wind is doing right now along the path where your bullet will travel. Those are two different pieces of information, and one of them is more useful." "Which one?" She said, "The shimmer." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because the bullet is not standing here with me." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had the tone he used when something mattered more than the words could fully carry. He said, "That is the whole thing. Everything else is detail. You can write a book about the rest of it, but that one sentence is the center of all of it. The bullet is not standing here with you. Always go where the bullet goes." She came back to the billet. She looked at the open notebook on her knees. She looked at the pen in her hand. She began to write. Not from her field notes, not from anything she had brought with her to Mackall, from memory, from 25 years of memory that began in a cold field in October with her eye against a rifle scope and her father's hands on her shoulders and his voice telling her the thing that was the center of everything. She wrote for 2 hours and 40 minutes without stopping. Every diagram, every correction table, every calculation and technical specification, every margin note she had read in the technical library by the light of that single overhead bulb, every page number and section reference, every field test result, every notation in her father's precise hand that she had memorized because she always memorized what mattered. She wrote it all in her own handwriting, in her own words, organized around the same single principle that her father had organized everything around, that the shimmer above the ground tells you a different and more accurate truth than any instrument at your position, and that this is not an opinion or a school of thought. It is physics. Physics does not change its behavior based on what is printed in a current training manual. They had taken the book. They had not considered that she carried the book inside her. She was on page 31 when the knock came. She checked her watch without moving from the bunk. 2:07. She set the notebook face down beside her. She said, "Enter." The door opened. A woman came in. She was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of face that disclosed very little, and the movement of someone who had learned to walk through institutional spaces without drawing attention. She wore no rank insignia at that hour, only a field uniform with her name tape, which read THEIS. She carried a manila folder under one arm that was thick enough to represent a considerable amount of accumulated time. She closed the door. She looked at the notebook lying face down on the bunk and the diagrams visible on the open page and the pen in Gail's hand. She said nothing about any of it. She pulled the desk chair to the center of the room and sat down with the quiet efficiency of a person who has prepared carefully for this moment. She set the folder on the desk. She said, "My name is Lona Thays. I am assigned to range intelligence oversight at this facility. I have been here 14 months. She said, "In the 8 months prior to your arrival, I have been documenting a pattern of assessment irregularities in the qualification records for this course. I have 41 cases, 41 candidates whose performance data was altered in ways that, in most cases, produced their removal from the program. The pattern is consistent across every case. Methodology deviation penalties applied selectively and disproportionately. Applied specifically to candidates whose actual performance outpaced the scores they received. Applied by one person. Over the course of 8 months before I began documenting, and based on the historical records I have been able to access, for a period considerably before that. She opened the folder and placed it on the desk so Gail could see the top sheet. A spreadsheet. Candidate numbers in the first column. Score fields across the rest. Selected fields highlighted in 2 colors. 8 months of evaluation records annotated in a hand that was patient and methodical and had been at this work for a long time. Gail looked at the document, then she looked at Thays. Thays said, "I can submit this file. I have been ready to submit it for 6 weeks, but a pattern of score manipulation without a corresponding demonstration that the correct methodology exists and that the affected candidates were capable of meeting the actual standard when assessed fairly, is difficult to sustain under formal review. What I have proves the scores were wrong. It does not prove what the right scores should have been." She folded her hands on her knees. She said, "I need a performance validation, a direct demonstration that the methodology your father documented produces the results he claimed, in the precise conditions where the standard method fails. I need it conducted at this facility's own range, using this facility's own equipment, observed and time-stamped in a way that is not attributable to a controlled or external environment." The room was quiet. Gail said, "When?" Thays said, "You have 48 hours before the departure order is enforced. I need this before that window closes. Tomorrow morning, before the first cadre formation." Gail said, "Where on the range?" Thays said, "East end of the long range line, the open northwest exposure, maximum mirage buildup in morning conditions." Gail said, "What is the distance?" Thays said, 1,800 yards. The number sat in the room between them, with the weight that very large numbers carry in very quiet spaces. Thays said, "The facility record for that lane in those conditions is 1,400 yards. The standard methodology is documented as unreliable beyond that distance under maximum mirage and full northwest wind. Your father's methodology shows a calculated correction that extends reliable effective range to 1,800 yards and beyond when applied correctly. 3 center hits at 1,800 yards in those conditions, using the method you have spent the last 2 hours writing from memory, gives me what I need to submit everything I have in a way that will hold." She said, "There is no authorization for that shot." Thays said, "No." She said, "The facility commander has ordered me off this installation within 48 hours. Thays said, "Yes." She said, "And if I miss?" Thays looked at her without expression. She said, "Then nothing I have is sufficient. 41 candidates receive no answer. The doctrine that ended your father's ability to correct the record, and that may have played a role in why he was where he was when he died, continues to be taught at this facility for another 20 years to soldiers who will carry it into mountain terrain above 7,000 feet and wonder why their holds are not connecting." The room held that statement for a moment. Gail looked at the folder. She looked at the diagrams she had been writing for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She looked at the empty space on the desk where the manual had been. She picked up the pen. She said, 1,800 yards. She turned back to page 31 and continued writing. She said, "Leave the folder. I will be at the east end of the long-range line at 4:30. Thays stood. She left the folder where it was. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. She said, without turning, "Your father submitted a formal technical report to Army Research, Development and Engineering Command in the spring of 2006. He identified the same pattern of score manipulation I have been documenting. He named the same evaluation cadre. He could not get anyone to act on it. He received a standard acknowledgement letter and no follow-up. He deployed to Korengal the following year. She left, the door closed. Gail sat in the quiet billet, the folder on the desk, the notebook on her knees, 48 hours that had just become 14. She turned to a new page. She kept writing. Across the courtyard, on the second floor of the administrative building, one window was still lit at that hour. Bale Prince sat at his desk with the canvas document sleeve open in front of him. He had not destroyed it. He had told himself when he took it from the billet that afternoon that he would decide what to do with it when he had time to think clearly. Time to think clearly had become evening, and evening had become past midnight, and the decision had not arrived. He opened the manual to the review and validation section at the back. 14 names on the list. He found his own name with the faint pencil circle and the handwritten line below it. Response pending. Exam results on file, Section 3, variable error. He looked at that line. Roe Wynn had written it in 1999. Roe Wynn had never come back to close it. He had filed the case as pending, and then 3 years later he was dead in a valley, and there was no one left to come looking for Section 3. Prin had spent 26 years waiting for someone to come looking for Section 3. He had spent 26 years building the only structure that kept anyone from looking. Section 3 of the 1999 evaluation contained the exam paper he had submitted during the long-range methodology review. The exam paper where he had applied the wind correction formula and arrived at the wrong answer, not because he did not understand the formula, but because he had changed one variable in the calculation before submitting it, because the correct variable produced a result that invalidated the doctrine he had already presented as his own original work to the evaluation board. He had changed the variable. He had submitted the wrong answer on purpose. Roe Wynn had noted it, had written pending, had never pursued it. And then Roe Wynn was gone, and the pending notation sat in a drawer somewhere for 26 years, and Prin had taught the wrong doctrine for 2 decades, and had spent every one of those years knowing exactly what variable he had changed and exactly why. He closed the manual. He put it in the locked drawer on the left side of his desk and turned the key. He held the key in his closed hand for a moment. He did not know why he was not destroying it. He had asked himself that question all evening and had not arrived at an answer that fully satisfied him. He had told himself it was because destroying a government document carried legal risk. He did not entirely believe that. The truth was something less rational and more human. The truth was that destroying it would mean making a final and permanent choice to be the man who had done all of this. And he had spent 26 years being almost that man, but not quite crossing the last inch of that distance. And the document in the locked drawer was the last inch he had not crossed. He put the key in his pocket. He turned off the desk lamp. He sat in the dark. The courtyard below his window was empty. The barracks were quiet. Somewhere past the tree line, past the sandhills, past the long expanse of the training area, the range sat in darkness with its steel targets standing at their measured distances. 1,800 yards. He had never made that shot. No one at this facility had ever made that shot in full northwest wind and morning mirage conditions. He sat in the dark with his hand in his pocket around a small brass key and thought about what morning would bring. And he could not determine whether what he felt was something closer to fear or something that, in another life and another man, might have been mistaken for relief. In the billet across the courtyard, a woman wrote by lamplight, page after page after page, the doctrine of a man who had understood something true and had died before the world was willing to listen. Tomorrow, in the pre-dawn dark, at 1,800 yards, the world would have one more opportunity. She was going to give it that opportunity, whether it wanted one or not. She arrived at the east end of the long-range line at 4:17. 13 minutes before the time she had given Thays. She had wanted those 13 minutes alone. The range at Camp Mackall was dark and empty, and the October air had dropped 20 degrees since sunset. The northwest wind that had built through the night was moving through the grass along the firing lane with the particular sound of something that knows exactly what it is doing. She stood at the line and listened to it, not to measure it yet, to be inside it first, to let the morning become familiar before she asked anything of it. She had carried the M2010 in its soft case and a single sealed box of match-grade ammunition that she had checked each round by hand the night before while Thays's folder sat on the desk beside her. She set the case on the firing mat and opened it, and removed the rifle with the same care she had used 4 days ago at the armory, the care that was not ritual but relationship. She ran her hands over the action in the dark. She did not need light. She had rebuilt this rifle in the dark the night she arrived. She knew every dimension of it the way you know the dimensions of something you have carried for a long time, the weight of it, the balance point, the small imperfection in the grip tape that she had left because removing it would change the feel, and the feel was already right. She had verified the zero from bore alignment before leaving the billet. She had calculated the come-ups for 1,800 yards in her notebook, working from the ballistic data she had memorized for this ammunition, and the correction tables she had spent 2 hours writing from memory the night before. Her father's correction tables. The numbers she had been carrying since she was 9 years old without knowing exactly when she would need them. She knew the shot. She had known the shot since before she could explain why. She sat up in the prone position on the firing mat. She adjusted the support until the weight of the rifle was balanced in a way that told her without looking that the plane was true. She settled her cheek to the stock. She looked through the scope into the pre-dawn dark, and the 1,800-yard lane stretched out before her with the steel target at the end of it invisible against the deeper dark of the tree line. She knew where it was. She had measured it herself the night before, on her hands and knees in the dark, with a laser rangefinder borrowed from no one. The rangefinder had read 1,803 yards. She had noted the 3 yards and accounted for them. She waited. The mirage was thin at this hour, just beginning to form as the overnight cold met the first thermal energy rising from the ground. She watched it through the scope at low magnification, and she watched the grass at mid-range, and she listened to the wind and let all of it come to her without urgency. Her father had taught her this too. He had called it the practice of arriving. Before you shoot, he said, you have to actually get there. Most people come to the firing line, and they are still somewhere else in their head, still in the truck or still at breakfast, or still in whatever argument they were having with themselves about whether they were ready. You have to get to the range before you can shoot on it. She was at the range. She heard footsteps on the gravel access path at 4:30. Thays came in quietly, carrying her folder and a small digital camera on a collapsible tripod which she assembled without speaking. She positioned the camera on a line that would capture both the firing position and the full length of the downrange lane. She checked the timestamp on the display. She confirmed the date and time were accurate to the second. She sat down behind and to the left of the firing mat with the folder open on her knees and said nothing. They waited in the pre-dawn dark together. The light began to change at 4:51. It did not arrive all at once. It built, the way a slow tide builds, giving slightly more than it had been giving, revealing the range in increments. The steel target at 1,800 yards was invisible. Then it was a suggestion of shape. Then it was a plate of weathered steel on a low stand at the far end of a lane of clay and scrubland, and the morning mirage was rising from the ground around it in the clear October air, and the northwest wind was moving through the grass along the full length of the lane in a way that she could read from where she lay. She was reading it when she heard a second set of footsteps on the access path. She recognized the pattern of them before she saw the man. Prynne came onto the firing line with Wickfield 2 steps behind him, and stopped when he saw the camera and the tripod, and the woman sitting with the folder and Gale in the prone with the rifle built and her cheek on the stock. He took in the arrangement with an expression that moved through several phases in a few seconds and settled on controlled certainty. He crossed his arms. He said, "Sergeant Wynne, you are in violation of your departure order. This range is closed to non-credentialed personnel during non-operational hours." She did not move. She said, "I will be finished in a few minutes." He said, "You will stand up from that mat immediately." She said, "No." Prynne looked at Thays. He said, "Chief Warrant Officer, you do not have authorization to conduct an official documentation action without coordination through this office." Thays said, "I am not conducting it without your coordination. You are present. You have been informed." Prynne looked at Wickfield. Wickfield looked at the camera. Neither of them moved. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 8 seconds. Into it came a fourth set of footsteps on the access path. Prynne heard them before he turned. When he turned, his face made an expression that lasted less than 2 seconds before he controlled it. It was the expression of a man who discovers that the room he believed he owned contained something he did not account for. Colonel Devlin Dane walked onto the firing line in a duty uniform with no headgear, moving at the pace of a man who is exactly where he intended to be and who did not hurry to get there, because hurrying would have implied that the situation required it. He was not breathing hard. He had not been called. He was here because he had decided to be here, and the weight of that decision was visible in the way he carried it. Prynne said, "Sir, I was in the process of removing Sergeant Wynne from the range." Dane looked at him for a moment. He said, "You were." Then he walked past Prynne and took a position to the side of the firing mat where he could see both Gale's position and the full downrange lane. He put his hands behind his back. He looked at 1,800 yards of October scrubland in the early light and was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into the left breast pocket of his uniform jacket and removed an envelope. The envelope was sealed with tape along the top, the tape darkened with age. He held it in both hands. He said, "Sergeant Wynne." She did not lift her cheek from the stock. She said, "Sir." He said, "I have been holding this since 2006. It arrived by post in September of that year. It was from your father." The range was very quiet. The wind moved through the grass at mid-range. Somewhere at the edge of the tree line, a bird settled into a branch and held still. Dane said, "I served alongside Roe Wynne in 1994 in a context I will not specify on a range. We were not close friends. We were the kind of men who recognized quality in each other's work and kept the rest at a professional distance. After he came to this facility as an instructor, we stayed in occasional contact, mostly technical correspondence, doctrine questions, curriculum concerns. He wrote the way he shot, without waste." He turned the envelope over once in his hands. He said, "In September 2006 I received this. I will read you the final paragraph." He opened the envelope with care. The care of a man who has opened the same envelope many times over 17 years and understands that some documents become more fragile each time you handle them. He read, "Devlin, I have filed the report and I expect nothing to come of it. The people who would need to act on it are the same people who benefit from the current arrangement. I have known that for 3 years. I'm not certain I will be able to see this through from where I am standing, but I believe someone will come. I believe a person will arrive at this facility one day who reads the ground the way the ground wants to be read, and when they do, what I could not finish will get finished. You will know them when they come. You will know them because they will not need to be told what the wind is doing. They will already know. When that person arrives, Devlin, do not get in their way. Dane folded the letter. He said, "Your father wrote that in September 2006, 17 months before he died. I read it twice, and then I sealed it in this envelope and placed it in my personnel file, and I waited." He looked at Gale in the prone position on the firing mat. He said, "You came through the gate 4 days ago. You shot a 600-yard group that the range officer measured twice because he could not accept the first measurement. You took lane 12 in a full northwest crosswind and put 8 rounds into center mass at 1,000 yards. You went to 160 yards in the stalking evolution without acquisition. And then you went to the library and found a document that I had chosen to leave findable. I placed it behind those training circulars myself in February 2008 when I arrived at this command and found it had already been pulled from the active collection and was scheduled for destruction. I did not know who I was leaving it for. I only knew that your father had told me someone would come." He looked out over the range. He said, "I have not interfered with the conduct of this course. That was not my role, but I am here this morning, and I am going to watch." He put his hands behind his back. He said, "Whenever you are ready, Sergeant." She did not respond. She was already back inside the morning, inside the wind and the light, and the 1,800 yards of air between her and the steel plate she could now see at the far end of the lane. The conversation behind her receded the way all irrelevant things recede when you are fully in the act of attending to something that matters. She watched the mirage. At this elevation, at this hour, in full northwest wind, the shimmer above the range surface was doing something that no kestrel meter at the firing position could measure. It was showing the truth of a long and complex column of air, from the mat where she lay all the way to the stand where the steel plate waited. It was showing her the wind's actual direction and actual speed not at her feet, where she already knew what the wind was doing, but across the entire flight path, where the bullet would travel and where the standard method had always been blind. She watched until she understood what it was saying. Then she made the correction her father had calculated, the correction that was not intuition but physics, the correction that had been suppressed for 17 years and that was now, in this specific early morning, being applied for the first time at this facility to a shot of this distance. She breathed. She pressed. The M2010 moved. The suppressed report was brief and final and the wind took it. 2.5 seconds later, at 1,800 yards, the steel plate rang. Thays did not speak. She was watching the camera display, verifying the timestamp, making a notation in her folder. Dane said nothing. Prin said nothing. Gale cycled the bolt. She reestablished her position. She watched the mirage again. The wind had not changed in any material way. The correction stood. She fired the second round. 2.5 seconds. The steel plate rang again. The quality of silence on that firing line changed between the second shot and the third. It became the specific silence of people who have witnessed something that has settled a question they may not have admitted they were still carrying. It was the silence of a long calculation, arriving at a number that neither confirms nor surprises, but simply resolves. She watched the mirage one final time. She fired the third round. 2.5 seconds. The steel plate rang. She kept her cheek on the stock for a full breath after the third impact. Then she stood up from the mat in one controlled motion, lifted the rifle, and cleared the chamber. She faced downrange. She looked at the steel plate at 1,800 yards, barely visible in the morning light, and she did not allow herself the expression she felt moving through her chest, because her father had taught her that a range is a place of work, and you do not perform at a place of work. She turned around. Thays was already closing her folder. The camera was still running. On the access path, a fifth figure had appeared at some point during the firing, a specialist from the administrative office who now held a clipboard and looked slightly uncertain about where to direct his attention. Dane stood with his hands behind his back. Wickfield had taken 2 steps back from Prynne. Prynne stood exactly where he had been standing when the first round went downrange. He was looking at 1,800 yards of range in the morning light. He was not looking at Gale. He was looking past her, at the distance, at the steel plate, at the thing that had just been demonstrated in front of 4 witnesses and a running camera, and his face held an expression that she had not seen on him before and could not fully name. It was not anger. It was not the controlled certainty he had worn since she arrived. It was the face of a man standing in the last moment before the understanding arrives, looking at something he already knows and has always known, and has spent 26 years arranging his life so that he would not have to look at directly. He looked at it now. She said, "Sergeant Prynne." He looked at her. She said, "Section 3, Variable Error, 1999. She said, "You changed the variable on purpose. You already knew the correct answer. You already knew the methodology was valid. You changed it because the correct answer proved something you had claimed as your own, and that was not." The range was quiet. He said nothing. She said, "My father flagged it. He did not pursue it. I do not know why he chose not to pursue it. He may have believed that a man who had done that at 26 years old might make a different choice at 30 or 40 or 50. He left the case open. He marked it pending. He gave you the time." She looked at him for a moment longer. She said, "You had 26 years. She picked up her equipment. She secured the rifle in its case. She shouldered her bag. She walked off the firing line. At the access path she passed Dane without speaking. He did not speak either. He gave her the slight forward nod of a man acknowledging something that has been completed, and she accepted it, and she kept walking. Behind her, on the firing line, Prynne had not moved. He was still looking at 1,800 yards. The formal inquiry opened 8 days later. It was conducted at a level above the facility, requested jointly by Chief Warrant Officer Thays and countersigned by Colonel Dane in a memo that ran to 11 pages, and that cited 42 cases of documented assessment irregularity, 1 confirmed pattern of fabricated weather data in candidate brief cards, and 1 live fire demonstration at 1,800 yards under maximum mirage and full northwest wind, time-stamped and corroborated by 4 witnesses. That validated the suppressed methodology at its most challenging stated operating parameter. The inquiry also examined the February 2008 administrative order. The suppression order had been countersigned by a facility commandant who had since retired to a house in coastal South Carolina. He submitted a written statement describing, in specific terms, the conversation that had produced his signature and the representations made to him about why the methodology required supersession. He stated that he had not read the document he was asked to supersede and had not sought independent review of the technical claims supporting the order. He stated that the request had come to him from within the facility's own instructional cadre. He stated that he had not asked enough questions. The area code on the number Prin had dialed from his administrative office on the second night, when Gale found the manual in the library, had been South Carolina. It had been a number Prin had not used in many years. When the retired commandant received that call, he had understood immediately what it meant. He had submitted his statement to the inquiry before the investigators reached him. Prin did not contest the inquiry findings. He submitted a written statement in the third week. It was 12 paragraphs long. In the 11th paragraph he wrote, "The 1999 evaluation contained an error that I introduced deliberately. I understood the methodology I was evaluating. I changed the variable because the correct result would have undermined a claim I had made to the evaluation board." Sergeant Wynne identified the error and notated it as pending. He did not report it or pursue it formally. I chose to interpret his silence as a closing of the matter. That was not what it was. I carried the error forward into 20 years of instruction. I knew every day that I was carrying it. He wrote, "I do not offer an explanation for why a man does what I did for 26 years because I am not certain the explanation, if I could produce one, would be of any value to anyone. I was afraid of what the correct answer would cost me. That is the whole of it." The 12th paragraph was 2 sentences. He wrote, "Sergeant Roe Wynne was the finest precision shooting instructor I have ever known. I have spent a great deal of time considering whether what I did was a response to that or a product of it, and I have not arrived at an answer that satisfies me, and I suspect I will not." Sergeant First Class Gale Wynne received her formal qualification at a facility outside Fort Bragg 6 weeks after the events at Camp Mackall, under an instructor she had never met, assessed by a board that had reviewed Thays's documentation and the live fire results, and had determined that the evidentiary standard was met, and that the qualification should be awarded without ceremony and without delay. She did not attend a ceremony. There was not one. What happened next, after the qualification was awarded and the inquiry concluded and the documentation was filed, was that the Army did what large institutions do with findings that require them to acknowledge that something they have been teaching is wrong. They formed a working group. They scheduled a curriculum review. They assigned the review to a board that included 3 of the original 14 reviewers from her father's 1999 documentation, 2 of whom were still in service, and 1 of whom had retired and was brought back as a consultant. The review was projected to take 18 months. Gale was not on the working group. She had been asked whether she wished to be considered for it. She had said no. She had said, "I have a notebook. The notebook has everything in it. If the working group wants the notebook, they can have it." They sent a major to collect the notebook. She gave it to him in a parking lot outside a commissary in Fayetteville on a Wednesday afternoon in December. It was the notebook she had spent 2 hours and 40 minutes filling in her billet at Mackall, 41 pages of diagrams and calculations and field specifications, reconstructed entirely from memory. She also gave him the canvas document sleeve her mother had handed her at the kitchen table. The major looked at it. He said, "What is this?" She said, "Open it." He opened the sleeve. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper in her father's handwriting. The sheet was dated October 1996. It was a cover letter addressed to the Army Research, Development and Engineering Command at Aberdeen Proving Ground, submitting for consideration a formal methodology for terrain-based wind estimation in mountain precision fire. Below the body of the letter was a list of enclosures. The first enclosure listed was terrain-based wind estimation, preliminary field results, Camp Mackall, October 1995 to March 1996. The second enclosure listed was corroborating observations, 14 independent evaluators, 1996 to 1999, pending. Below the list in a different ink, added at a later date, her father had written one line. He had written, "Someone will finish this." The major looked at the document. He was 33 years old and had spent 12 years in the army, and he was not a man given to visible feeling. He looked at the document for a moment longer than the situation required. Then he folded it carefully and put it back in the sleeve. He said, "I will make sure this goes with the notebook." She said, "I know you will." She drove home. The field outside Fayetteville was still there, the field where she had been 9 years old with a rifle scope and a cold morning and her father's hands on her shoulders, and his voice telling her the thing that was the center of everything. She drove past it without stopping. She did not need to stop. She carried the field inside her the same way she had carried the notebook inside her, the same way she had carried everything that mattered since the morning her mother had handed her a sealed envelope across a kitchen table and said that Roe had wanted her to have it and that she would know when the time came. She had known. The steel plate at 1,800 yards had told her she had known. She drove north out of the city in the December afternoon, with the low sun coming in off the right side, and the longleaf pines along the highway standing in their particular way, tall and still and patient, the way things stand when they have been in one place long enough to stop caring whether anyone notices. She drove. She let the road come. She did not look back.